Hi, it's been interesting to hear the backgrounds that Brian just gave and Joseph Cannon at the end of the last panel, because I have somewhat similar story to tell about my own religious background. I grew up in Orem, Utah, with an awareness of religious pluralism that came largely from books. I learned about Jews from Sidney Taylor's charming all-of-a-kind family books about a Jewish family in pre-World War I New York City, and later from the novels of Chaim Potok. I also noticed I'm the third Latter-day Saint here to mention Potok. There's definitely some there. And also about Catholics from the Great Brain series, which described a Catholic family in late 19th century Utah. In such books, I encountered exciting terms like Purim and Seder and Jesuit and penance. But actual live human beings of other faiths were few and far between. I remember once sitting on a school bus talking to a girl who mentioned in passing that she was not LDS. I felt acutely awkward. I remember consciously struggling not to treat her differently, and yet realizing that the very fact that I had to make an effort already indicated the existence of a barrier between us. My life was populated by Latter-day Saints to an extent that I was unsure of the rules for interaction with anyone else. I did eventually leave Utah, make non-LDS friends, and become accustomed to life in a more religiously diverse world. But while I was intrigued by the religious beliefs of others, my interest in pluralism remained largely academic until I decided to begin theological studies. This is perhaps a recipe for being consumed by pluralist angst, and it hit me hard. In particular, I took a course on Jewish-Christian relations in which we grappled with issues of proselytizing and truth claims, and suddenly I saw my tradition with new eyes. I became obsessed. Did the LDS claim to be the only true church preclude any possibility of genuine dialogue with other faiths? Was proselytizing even ethical? How, if at all, did other religions fit into LDS theology? Was it possible to be LDS without being completely obnoxious, taking a smugly superior view of everyone else? But could you give up exclusive truth claims without undermining the very fabric of the tradition? These were the questions that kept me up at night. I talked about them endlessly. I still feel a little bad. One of my younger sisters was leaving on a mission at the time and had to listen to me have a pluralist crisis, but we all survived. This issue has become somewhat less emotionally intense with time, thankfully, but I'm not sure I've ever really recovered. These questions remain potent ones for me. I've spent much of the past decade studying what Latter-day Saints might refer to as apostate Christianity, and I periodically attempt to make some theological sense of what I am doing, which, contrary to the expectations of some members of the church, does not involve rolling my eyes at how ridiculous these ideas are and feeling gratitude that I have the truth. My own religious outlook has been shaped by Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon, but also by Augustine and the Catholic theologian Karl Rahner that Brian just mentioned. And yet at the same time, I want to say that it means something to me to be LDS, that the tradition is more than simply one of many that has influenced my beliefs, that it has a particular claim on me. So this is the personal background I bring to a discussion of pluralism. In grappling with these kinds of questions, I realize that I am far from unique. As we have seen, religious pluralism poses some of the most challenging issues for contemporary believers. LDS teachings bring some unique perspectives to this discussion. The most commonly cited LDS answer to the problem of pluralism, of course, is an appeal to ordinances available in a postmortal realm. In fact, I once heard someone say that if only Karl Rahner had known about baptism for the dead, he would not have needed to construct his theological system. I am, however, skeptical that the trump card of postmortal ordinance work is enough to adequately answer questions of pluralism. And this goes back to that Eugene England quote that Brian just said. Given the emphasis LDS teachings place on the importance of this life, it would be odd indeed to assert that for 99.9% of the world's population, the crucial and saving aspects of this life will actually be deferred to the next one. Rather than looking to post-mortality, then, I would like to go in the other direction and consider what LDS teachings about a pre-mortal realm contribute to a discussion of pluralism. For Latter-day Saints, after all, this life can only truly be understood in the context of the existence which preceded it, and this is an important background for thinking about the existence of multiple faiths. LDS teachings, as we have mentioned, clearly allow for the possibility of some kind of revelation outside the church. However, to assert the existence of truth outside the church in some ways makes the issue more confusing. A popular Mormon theory is the fragment one, which asserts that other traditions have fragments of the truth but not the whole package, which can be found only in the LDS church. However, this raises the question of why God would reveal the complete gospel to some, while only giving others bits and pieces. Why doesn't God just establish his authorized church with the fullness of the gospel in multiple places? If this sounds like an absurd proposition, recall that this very situation is described in the Book of Mormon, which reports a second set of 12 apostles existing in the New World, and hints at still other authorized groups. Perhaps such a thing is no longer tenable in an age of global communication, when such a setup could lead to a confusing situation of competing authorities, though such a concern in and of itself reflects the limits of revelation. In any case, a proposal that God is focusing his attention and communication on one particular religious organization, while at best allowing fragments to filter to others, goes against not only the teachings of the Book of Mormon, but the implicit theology underlying its very existence, as a testimony that God's revelation and involvement is not confined to any one single group of people. From an LDS perspective, it is also particularly notable that some mainstream Christian theologians have argued that if Christians are going to take other faiths seriously, they must abandon the notion that there is no new revelation. And if a pluralist approach requires openness to new revelation, Latter-day Saints are well positioned to think in pluralist terms. If nothing else, the assertion in the 9th article of faith that God still has much yet to reveal challenges the notion that anyone, even the church, can claim to have the final, definitive, last word on everything. I thus propose that a more credible version of the fragment theory might be to point to the limitations of all faiths. This is to not have to undermine the claim that the LDS Church plays a particular and significant role in God's plan, or that it is in possession of certain vital truths, but it leaves room for the possibility that something like that could be said of other religions. But what would be the purpose of revelation outside the church? For many pluralist theologians, the whole point of proposing legitimate revelation in diverse places is to allow for multiple paths to salvation. LDS teachings, by contrast, indicate the existence of revelation outside the church while simultaneously asserting exclusive authority to perform saving ordinances. Given that, I think we must approach revelation outside the church in the context of a broader notion of salvation, one linked to the idea of eternal progression. Saving ordinances are apparently crucial at some point for such progression, but it seems clear that they are not crucial in this life, given that the vast majority of people do not have the opportunity to receive them. If salvation refers to the specific event of receiving saving ordinances, it is difficult to see the purpose of revelation that is not directly connected to this event. But if salvation is understood as an ongoing process, one which at some point necessarily includes saving ordinances but encompasses more than that, all revelation can be seen as genuinely salvific. And this brings me to the doctrine of a premortal existence and what it tells us about the purpose of this life. The church asserts as one of its selling points its ability to answer those favorite missionary questions: where did I come from? What is my purpose in life? What happens when I die? The purpose of life is usually described in 3 general categories: physical embodiment, experience, development, and learning, and the proper use of agency. Presumably, and this is a key point, none of these were available in the same way in the premortal realm. We were not physically embodied. We were limited in our ability to learn and progress, and we did not have the chance to exercise agency in the same way that we do here. This is not, of course, to say that we were unable to learn or develop at all, or that we had no agency prior to this life. Clearly that is not the case. But the experience of mortality must add some kind of significant dimension. What kind of learning, then, can we get in this life that was unavailable in the previous one? Where, in the presence of God and without the constraints of mortality, one would think that we actually had much more potential to learn. It seems unlikely that this consists solely of intellectual learning, even learning such important truths as the nature of God or the plan of salvation, because according to the LDS teachings, our knowledge of such things was something we gave up to come to mortality. This is an important background to the problem of the truth claims of competing religions. If interfaith dialogue is understood solely as an intellectual effort to sort out whose religious claims are correct, from an LDS perspective, it is backwards looking. It is a conversation that would have made more sense to have in the premortal realm. It would make little sense for us to come to mortality simply to relearn, and in a very partial way at that, what we already knew. It seems more plausible that the learning we seek here is experiential learning, a learning that no theoretical premortal understanding of earth life could give us. And this learning is tied to living in a context of ambiguity, one in which we see through a glass, darkly. What then might be the value of dialogue, and specifically dialogue under such conditions? One possibility is that the process of engaging others in such conversations is more significant than its purported end. This brings me to one of the other purposes of life I mentioned, that of providing a particular context for agency, sometimes described in terms of a test. We are directed to use our agency well, to choose wisely, as they say in Indiana Jones. A verse in the book of Abraham states, "We will prove them herewith, to see if they will do all things whatsoever the Lord their God shall command them." But again, I raise the question of why couldn't this be accomplished in the premortal realm? And in fact, isn't this a rather strange test, given that God does not seem to be communicating very clearly that there is in fact much disagreement about just what these commandments are? It is as if I went to take a biology exam and discovered that I had to guess which questions the professor intended to ask, and my eternal salvation depended upon guessing right. One way Latter-day Saints might address this problem is through an appeal to the doctrine of the light of Christ as something available to everyone, which I think may have some parallels to Ronner's notion of the anonymous Christian, and to the notion that people will be judged according to the light that they were given. Though these are clearly important aspects of LDS teachings, I would also suggest that the test of life, if it is to be called that, is not just about following God, but specifically about following God in a situation of ambiguity and uncertainty. What is the value of finding ourselves in such a situation? For one thing, it makes us desperately need each other, as it is only through communicating with others that we can transcend the limits of our own perspectives. Additionally, the challenges posed by being in relation with others who see differently, I would argue, gets to the core of what this life is all about. This is not to downplay the value of intellectual endeavor or the efforts to articulate truth claims and test them. As an aspiring academic theologian, I am in fact heavily invested in such an enterprise. But we are told to seek learning both by study and also by faith. What does it mean to learn by faith? My understanding of faith is not as a kind of act of cognitive willpower in which we force ourselves to believe that which appears nonsensical. Rather, I see it as involving both an appreciation of the limits of one's knowledge and understanding, and therefore an openness to possibility, and also a willingness to make commitments in a world of ambiguity. Both of these ingredients, I will argue, are essential for genuine dialogue. Which brings me to the topic of dialogue more specifically. A challenging theological question is that of how to understand the diversity of religious experience. One possibility is that everyone shares some kind of common experience, the elephant, that we are simply articulating it using different language and metaphor, that all religions can be boiled down to some kind of basic common essence. The idea is appealing because it puts us all on the same footing, so to speak, and precludes the possibility of serious disagreement. We might even appeal to LDS teachings to support such a notion. The doctrine of premortality indicates that all humans have an experience of and relationship to God prior to coming to this life. We might therefore posit the existence of forgotten but nonetheless shared memories of a time before, and thus some kind of common denominator underlying our various faiths. Somewhat intriguingly, we talk about helping others recognize the Spirit, a goal that suggests that they have an experience which fits into our theology. We only need to give them the language to express it. Would LDS teachings on personal revelation indicate that the variety of expressions of faith in different traditions are merely articulating some kind of common religious experience? But there are dangers in adopting such a perspective. It fails to take the claims of religion seriously on their own terms and does not account for the possibility that such claims might lose something in being translated into our own framework. The fragment theory that I mentioned earlier can be a real barrier to communication if we are simply looking for nuggets that we agree with. Is this not working?
Do you want to stop for a second?
Yeah, I'll hold off.
This is good. We want it on
I don't
tape.
want to. Did it just die? I haven't been paying attention. Okay. Okay. It's not like you've all been zoning out for 2 pages and like, she's still talking?
Go back a paragraph.
Okay.
Yeah, go back.
Test it out.
Okay, sound good? All right, so I'm back to saying, but LDS teachings on personal revelation indicate that the variety of expressions of faith in different traditions are merely articulating a common religious experience. But the danger of adopting such a perspective is that it fails to take the claims of religion seriously on their own terms and does not account for the possibility that such claims might lose something in being translated into our own framework. The fragment theory that I mentioned earlier can be a real barrier to communication if we are simply looking for nuggets that we agree with, rather than engaging other faiths in any sort of complex way. and we thereby close off any possibility of actually learning anything new from others. Alternately, some propose that religious experience and claims be understood as an essentially private phenomenon. This underlies the popular assertion that everyone has the truth that works for them, or the rather bland variety of pluralism that asserts that many roads lead to God and avoids any discussion of the merits of different roads. Again, this has the advantage of sidestepping conflict, but at the cost of any real communication or critical thought about various religious claims. I draw here on the work of theologian David Tracy, who critiques this contemporary tendency to put religion in a private sphere, making it into something that is simply a matter of personal taste, rather than something which makes broader claims. This is a problem, he points out, because God is universal, and speech about God cannot therefore be private speech. Any authentic speech on the reality of God, which is really private or particularist, he says, is unworthy of that reality. To think more about these issues in an LDS framework, I again return to the doctrine of the premortal life. I see two particular points of interest in the teachings we have about what took place there. First, we articulated our beliefs in a public realm. The discussion of the plan of salvation was clearly a public one. We did not retreat into seeking private plans of salvation that worked for us. The doctrine of premortality is also significant in establishing our spiritual connections to each other as fellow children of God and as beings who were in relation before this life. This gives us a strong reason to believe in the possibility of genuine communication, even when the beliefs of others seem radically alien. However, another significant aspect of the premortal life is the existence of disagreement. We did not all think alike, even without the limits of mortality and in the presence of God. This is, of course, most obviously demonstrated by the war in heaven. I would also propose that as eternal intelligences with unique identities, it seems unlikely that we all had the same perspective on the universe, or that our individual relationships with and experience of God were generic cookie-cutter ones. In any case, we have an understanding of premortality that incorporates both similarity and difference, somewhat parallel to the challenge we face here in engaging other faiths. We cannot either retreat to a private understanding of truth or posit some common denominator of ultimate agreement. How do we negotiate this tension between difference and similarity? David Tracy proposes the use of what he calls an analogical imagination, a stance which simultaneously grants the otherness of the other, difference, while recognizing the possibilities that the other presents for the tradition in which one finds oneself, similarity. Analogical language looks to produce some amount of order and harmony, but not a forced one that overlooks negation and difference. We need to be cautious of easy analogy, he warns, and remember that the similarities of analogy are similarities in difference. What little I understand of Buddhist compassion, he explains, I do not understand on inner Buddhist grounds of enlightenment. Yet I can respond to that classic Buddhist notion with a resonance to the challenges it poses to my own Catholic understanding of love as caritas. I see much potential for this approach in the framework of LDS beliefs. As I have been working through these questions, I have been thinking about my own experience of talking to people about their religious beliefs. Though it may not happen in a very formal way, given my current situation as a theology student in a very religiously diverse school, this is a regular part of my life. And it occurred to me that when I hear the phrase interfaith dialogue, I seem to imagine it as a kind of exchange of propositional truths. But I'm not sure why I imagine it that way, because while this kind of thing may happen in some circumstances, it is not at all typical of the actual conversation that takes place in the interfaith context in which I live. We don't usually recite things like the Articles of Faith or sections of the Catholic Catechism to each other. Or if we do, we follow it up with a discussion of what a particular doctrine means to us, how we make sense of it, how it's influenced our thinking and our lives. Put another way, we share stories. And noting this narrative aspect, I think, is a helpful way of thinking about what is involved in the process of interfaith dialogue. Encountering the stories of others can be profoundly transformative. Using Paul Ricoeur's terminology, they open up new possible worlds. This might be one way of thinking about the question I posed earlier about whether a model of interfaith dialogue focused solely on propositional truth claims is simply replicating conversations that could have taken place in the premortal realm. Stories, on the other hand, convey the experiential knowledge that is so fundamental to this life, and in sharing them, we are calling one another to new possibilities and ways of thinking. Tracy also points out that genuine dialogue involves risk. Crucially, persons willing to converse must also be willing to consider that the possibility that they might be wrong. From an LDS perspective, this might seem a strange stance. We might wonder why we would ever want to take such a risk. But we could similarly ask, why was it worth it to take the risk of mortality, not knowing how it would change us, not knowing what we would end up believing? In a way, the risk is the point. It is how we learn to become more like God. In a world in which we cannot be sure of outcomes, the choice to love, to be open to others, is always a risk, and it is precisely this fact which makes it so meaningful. I also want to note that interfaith dialogue is not a call to transcend our faith claims and think from some neutral or detached perspective. Tracy warns of a genial confusion in which one tries to enjoy the pleasures of difference without ever committing oneself to any particular vision of resistance and hope. An affirmation of plurality, he emphasizes, should be the beginning of the conversation, not the end. The cheerful idea that all religions have some truth to offer, I note, is rarely, if ever, grounded in an in-depth study of every existing religion. Rather, it arises from a particular theological assumption about the relation of God and humanity. We do not have to give up our particular religious worldviews in favor of some kind of vague, pluralist enlightenment to engage in meaningful conversation. In fact, if we take this move, we are left with nothing to say. I mention this because I think that we Latter-day Saints sometimes fear that involvement in this kind of mutual interfaith dialogue requires that we first set aside any commitment to our particular truth claims. But I am in fact proposing here that our particular beliefs, far from being something we need to abandon to converse with religious others, in fact give us a motivation for doing so. And what about the possibility of truth claims? Theologians often speak of our situation between the already and the not yet, partially realized eschatology, in which we can speak of being saved and of Christ having completed his saving work, but the end, the culmination, has not yet come. We live in between. Something similar could be said of our knowledge. We know in part, says Paul. We still live in an in-between where we both know and do not know, and we cannot let go of either side of this tension, lest we fall into overconfident smugness or radical nihilism. The truth claims we make must of necessity be provisional, perhaps particularly so in a church with continuing revelation. And yet our awareness of this cannot scare us away from asserting anything at all, because our faith calls us to speak, to give us a reason for the hope that is within us. In conclusion, I would propose that pluralism is not just a strange mortal phenomenon that we must find a way to explain, something that God tolerates in a fallen world, but that we can move beyond that and see it as an important aspect of the purpose of life as described in LDS teachings. In fact, I would go even further and argue that pluralism is a basic aspect of the LDS universe. Some mainstream Christian theologians appeal to the Trinity as a model of the plurality at the heart of being. If anything, this seems even more deeply embedded in Mormonism with its worlds without number and council of gods, its eternal intelligences and premortal disagreements, and above all, in the LDS approach to salvation, which includes relationships of similarity and difference and a deeply relational vision of binding the human family together. Scripture tells us that eternal life consists in knowing the only true God. Theologian Mark Heim makes the point that every relationship is unique, and this includes the relationship of humans to God. The implication is that we need each other to know God more fully, because on our own, we can only know God in the context of that individual relationship. Given the pluralism in the LDS universe, our understanding of the purpose of life is tied to experiential learning and our focus on relationality, I argue that Latter-day Saints have strong theological reasons for taking the risk of serious engagement with other faiths. Interfaith dialogue is not just a good thing to do, it has salvific potential.